Friends, hello! Well, we've all seen cowboy movies and have a rough idea of what the Wild West is like, which in itself is amazing, well, if you think about it. As American culture has become a culture that influences the rest of the culture in the world, its main myth becomes such a worldwide property. And that the Wild West is primarily a myth, there's no doubt about it. For America, the Wild West was to America what the Mediterranean was to the ancient Greeks. It's the kind of uncharted space that heroes sought out. There was a reward waiting for the wild and fearless, but almost all were eventually caught up in random and strange deaths. Here arose their epics, their legends, and the most famous characters could easily sit down to warm themselves by your fire. But the real Wild West bore little resemblance to what's shown in the movies. The cowboys, the revolvers, the robberies, everything we love westerns for, was completely different from what we're used to. It was even crazier. Let's travel to the frontier where Wild Bill, Jesse James, White Herb, and Butch Cassidy roamed in search of adventure, and find out what it was really like out there. Let's get started. What do you think of this announcement? Wanted. For the position of sheriff, we need a man with a rhinoceros skin, bulletproof head, able to see everything around him, running faster than a horse, not afraid of anything and no one, neither in hell nor in the Coolidge. A man who can shoot accurately and would rather shoot 4 or 5 drunken debauchees before breakfast than sit down at the table without such a morning exercise. This is the kind of ad that was placed in a newspaper with the awesome title, Border Ruffian. It was placed by residents of the town of Coolish in 1886. It sounds, of course, comical, but behind this humor hides the harsh truth of life in the Wild West. In Texas alone, bandits killed about 100 sheriffs in 10 years from 1869 to 1878. It's no wonder that former bandits who were famous as desperate killers were favored for the sheriff's seat. The frontier, that is, the very, very fringes of the Wild West, where there was no law but the law of the gun, it beckoned the most desperate. But even the simple, peaceful settlers there quickly became savage, turning into a mob of savages or even murderers. The 19th century historian Frederick Turner described their mores in color. He wrote, in particular, that the frontiersman tears off the settler's civilized clothes. He puts him in an Indian log cabin and forces him to scalp his enemies according to Indian custom, emitting the Indian battle cry. Well, Turner, of course, was sharpening things up a bit for polemical purposes, but that's roughly what it was. The important point is that each settler had several guns. There were 4 forces trying to uphold the law in this chaos. First, the feds. The Marshals Service are representatives of the federal government. There were very few of them, and they mostly guarded courthouses and other government buildings and tracked down the nation's most dangerous criminals. Roughly speaking, their main job was to make sure the people didn't burn down the city hall and hang the mayor. What kind of investigations are there? The second force was the sheriffs. Sheriffs were elected in charge of their county and kept order by their authority, so the locals were quite happy to get some notorious gangster or murderer for the job. The third force was the bounty hunters, that is, bounty hunters. They sought out known criminals for a bounty. From the community of these noble thugs was born, for example, the famous Pinkerton Agency, which became the largest private law enforcement agency in the world. Well, and fourth, perhaps the most effective arm of the law on the frontier, lynch trials. Well, banally speaking, lynch trials. Ordinary civilians of the Wild West easily and casually hung criminals from trees if the guilt of these criminals seemed obvious. The key word being seemed. It was not uncommon to settle scores with rivals or old enemies in this way. There were even professional vigilantes called regulators. By the way, well, in America, the lynch trial was officially declared illegal, just think about it, in 2022. What were they hanging for? Well, the most serious crimes in the Wild West were 4: cold-blooded murder, rape, horse theft, and cattle theft. Note, 2 of the 4 were animal theft. The thing is, at first, banks weren't very much of interest to the bandits in the frontiers. Well, first of all, bank vaults were always well guarded. Secondly, it was much harder not to rob a bank and then escape with the money. Whose money was in the safe, right? Local residents. And the whole town, or even the whole county, would usually rush after the robbers. Well, in the end, most of the robbers predictably ended up in the nearest tree after the first raid. Stealing cattle was much easier, safer, and sometimes more profitable. Break the stigma, and you're no longer a criminal, but a noble cattleman. The Wild West gangs switched to banks and trains because of one invention. In 1874, barbed wire was invented, and it instantly covered vast areas, making it difficult to steal cattle. Money had to be stolen, but also there was a huge spike in crime after the Civil War. Many Confederate soldiers, hiding from the new authorities, rushed west. They saw the depredations of the damned Yankees as revenge for the vilified South. The hero of this world, for obvious reasons, was the so-called ganfighter, a lone gunfighter riding a horse and wearing a distinctive hat. Westerns and tabloid novels have created an image of these gunfighters that is, of course, very different from reality. Almost the most glaring myth of Westerns is the hero with a revolver. But in reality, many gunfighters favored the shotgun. Revolvers were inaccurate, unreliable, and smokeless powder had not yet been invented. So after a couple of shots, the cowboy would find himself in a cloud of smoke, and then he had to shoot by ear. The advantage of the revolver was that it could be carried relatively discreetly. But no one carried it on their side like they do in the movies. These guns had so many spontaneous discharges that injuries and deaths from them were considered commonplace. No one wanted to shoot off the most important things, so the revolver was worn on the front of the belt. If necessary, the shooter would unbuckle the holster with his left hand, snatch the weapon with his right hand, and then pull the trigger with his left. The shot was not aimed, but simply plus or minus in the direction of the enemy. The incredible marksmanship of the gang fighters is also, of course, a myth. Weapons were imperfect, bullet velocity was much slower than it is now. So modern firearms are 7 to 8 times more accurate than Wild West revolvers. Besides, the average time it took to fire a revolver of those years was not half a second, as they show us in Westerns, but a second and a half. Many people were in a hurry, pressed the trigger in advance to save time, and ended up hitting themselves in the foot or knee instead of the enemy. In short, shooting in the Wild West was not a filigree dance of great masters, but a chaotic and often drunken buffoonery. Shooting from the hip is also a myth, as is firing 2 revolvers at once, especially when you consider that you had to cock the revolver again after each shot. Shooters carried 2 revolvers, not to pelt the enemy with lead from 2 hands, but because the guns often misfired and the second revolver was simply a spare. Dozens and hundreds of dead gunfighters are the wildest of myths. Legendary Wild Bill Hickok killed only 6 men. Bet Masterson and John Ring each have 2 bodies to their credit. It wasn't the number of kills that made them legends, but their charisma and coolness, as well as their indifference to their own and other people's lives. Most conflicts were resolved bloodlessly. Whoever looked scariest won. The last but most persistent myth is duels, a constant motif in Westerns. In reality, of course, they were rare. Bandits ended their lives in a noose, and gang fighters, including sheriffs, usually got a bullet in the back of the head. Killing an enemy from under a thrust in the back, and in a crowd of 1, is a typical Wild West victory. No wonder the average life expectancy of a gunner did not exceed 35 years. And yet on the frontier there were truly legendary stories, although not exactly as they are shown in the movies. And there were real living legends operating there. Well, Jesse James, for example. Some call him the greatest bandit in American history, a romantic, the Robin Hood of the Wild West. Others consider him a cold-blooded murderer, a psychopath, and a loser who avenged his loss in the Civil War. Jesse James is the frontier's most famous robber. He was born in 1847 in the state of Missouri. His father was a preacher, then became a treasure hunter, but died of pneumonia somewhere in California on the mines, never seeing his son. Jesse's mother, a woman with the exotic name of Zerelda, married twice more. Her third husband, a physician by profession, owned a large estate and a large fortune, and most importantly, loved all of her children, including her adopted children. The estate prospered, and in general, would-be Jesse James would be a wealthy heir. But in 1861, the Civil War broke out. His brother Frank, who was 18, went into the Southern Army, and 14-year-old Jesse stayed on the estate. One day, the Yankees came into the county on a punitive expedition. They were destroying the property of those who supported the Confederates, and the doctor's estate was in their path. His stepfather was hanged for harboring Southern soldiers. Jesse was beaten to a pulp, and the estate was burned. When he came to his senses, he went to the front to his brother. He was serving in the most brutal and implacable unit of the Southerners. The guerrillas, known as Quantrill's horsemen, were characterized by an absolutely fierce malice. After the war, when the Confederates were granted amnesty, the horsemen were just about the only unit that was not pardoned. The Northerners, of course, can be understood. Even the Southerners themselves at some point began to disassociate themselves from the self-proclaimed Colonel William Quantrill and his barbaric methods. The horsemen dismembered the bodies of their opponents, scalped them, which they then hung from their saddles. In 1863, they burned down an entire town in Kansas, hanging more than 150 civilians from trees. Bloody Bill Anderson's unit, where Jesse James and his brother ended up, was particularly atrocious. Anderson never took prisoners and was famous for carrying a whole arsenal: 4 revolvers on his belt, 4 rifles on his horse, a saber, an axe, and a bunch of pistols just in case. All in all, the brothers, who were still teenagers at the time, received the sternest mentor in the entire Army of the South. With the end of the war, the Quantrillo riders were outlawed. Even the Confederates themselves refused to justify their crime. Instead of amnesty, Jesse James was shot in the lung and barely survived. The path to a peaceful life was closed to him. The James brothers met the equally desperate younger brothers, and so soon began the story of a gang that would be adored and hated by all of America. Their first big case proved to be a landmark. On February 13, 1866, they committed the first daytime bank robbery in American history. The target was the Savings Association of Liberty City, Missouri, a town that was considered a stronghold of the Northerners. The bottom line was $20,000 in coins, $14,000 in bills, and $42,000 in bonds. After this blow, the bank went bankrupt. Revenge was successful. Jesse himself was the think tank of the gang. He devised the plan, but he didn't take part in it. His wound hadn't healed yet. Well, in all, the gang robbed 12 banks, 5 trains, and 5 delinquents. The Jameses and Youngers were different from the other gangs. They came from wealthy families, had good manners, good education, behaved emphatically and politely during robberies, made jokes while stopping at farms. Gang members paid for everything they ate and drank, and generally behaved like gentlemen. However, at the slightest sign of insubordination, James used force. He has a number of cold-blooded murders to his credit. Another hallmark of Jesse and his men was Army discipline. Weapons and horses were always in perfect condition. But the most curious feature of the gang, active work with the public. They even had a PR man of sorts, former Confederate commander and media mogul John Newman Edwards. He actually took on the job of promoting the gang in the media. He wrote about them as modern-day Robin Hoods who only robbed greedy Northerners and gave the money to poor Southerners, which of course wasn't true, but it sounded very nice. He gave Jesse James the opportunity to speak openly in the pages of his newspapers. Of course, the noble bandit insisted that robbing banks was simply forced. It's not who we are, it's life. Well, the media magnate promoted his newspapers through his cooperation with the gang and soon became the leading newspaperman in the state of Missouri. But glory had a downside. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, the most dangerous enemies of crime in the Wild West, had taken over the gang. However, to catch the clever and careful accomplices of Jesse James failed. They often changed their names, moved, and the Southerners who adored them would never give up theirs. After another failure, Allan Pinkerton, head of the agency, ordered the house of Jesse James's mother to be set on fire. It made no sense at all because Jesse hadn't lived there in a long time. It was just a gesture of desperation and anger. On the night of January 26, 1875, an army of Pinkerton agents arrived at the Zerelda estate. An incendiary bomb was thrown through the window, and soon the kerosene stored in the pantry caught fire. The fire was rapid. Jesse's mother lost an arm, and his 8-year-old half-brother, who was the first to see the crowd of strange people in the yard, suffered terrible burns and died in agony. The senselessness and cruelty of the action struck all America. Pinkerton's agents were called baby killers, monsters, and arsonists of defenseless widows, which they were. The head of the agency, of course, denied his participation in the attack, but documents that surfaced later proved that he personally organized the arson. The authorities knew the truth, but stood idly by. Pinkerton bribed the officials. From then on, Jesse James's luck ran out. The worst failure was the massacre in Northfield, Minnesota. On September 7, 1876, a gang of richly dressed bandits arrived in Northfield to rob a local bank. The deed seemed easy. The town was populated by God-fearing, good-natured residents who spoke with a funny accent, mostly immigrants from Sweden. The problems began immediately. The bank teller refused to open the safe even after a beating. He didn't want to give up his neighbors, friends, and relatives' money. This was the first time Jesse James had encountered such courage, became confused, and lost precious time. At this time, the Swedes, realizing what was coming, rallied with the whole town, bringing revolvers, shotguns. Those who didn't have guns took axes, pitchforks, and rocks. This was also the first time the Jesse James gang had encountered such a civic initiative. The firing was so dense that the bandits didn't even have time to fire back. A massacre ensued. Some were shot off a leg, some an arm, some a shoulder. One of the younger brothers had his jaw ripped off. In the midst of it all, a dead man rode a panicked horse. His face was a bloody mess, but his dead fingers gripped the reins tightly. The gang was wiped out, almost all of them dead. The younger brothers survived, but they were caught and each received 25 years in prison. Bob Younger died in custody, and Jim and Cole were released in 1901. Jim, who had his jaw shot off, was unable to adjust to the new world and shot himself shortly after his release. And Cole died in 1916. The only one who wasn't seriously injured and was able to escape was Jesse James himself. But the incident at Northfield broke him. He became violent and indifferent to other people's lives. He recruited a new gang of similarly unscrupulous bastards, and the new gang was followed by a trail of murders of innocent civilians. It was the new members, Charlie Ford and his brother Robert, who put an end to the gang. They colluded with the government and agreed to kill Jesse James. And they did it in the most despicable way possible. On April 3, 1882, Jesse invited the Ford brothers to his home to discuss a new bank robbery. At this point, his wife was cooking dinner in the kitchen and his children were playing outside. When he turned away, Robert pulled out a revolver and shot him in the back of the head. The killers thought they had a lucky break. The government granted them amnesty, gave them lots of money, and they generally considered themselves national heroes. Except the nation didn't appreciate what they did. Instead of glory for the killer of the great Jesse James, Robert Ford got the popular nickname, Dirty Little Coward. He couldn't escape that nickname until his death. Ford tried to hide out in Colorado, where he opened a saloon. People still went there in droves to see that dirty little coward. In 1892, Robert was shot by an adventurer who himself dreamed of becoming famous by killing the murderer Jesse James. And Ford's brother shot himself, fearing revenge and humiliation. Jesse James was buried on the family farm, with several lawmen and his brother Frank attending the funeral. Surprisingly, the marshals wouldn't touch him, even though he was a wanted man, out of respect for his grief. The gravestone bore the inscription, Jesse W. James, died April 3, 1882, aged 34 years, 6 months, and 28 days, murdered by a traitor and coward whose name is unworthy of mention. There's a great movie about James's murder, starring Brad Pitt, with the telling title, How Cowardly Robert Ford Killed Jesse James. Well, the Pinkerton Agency still exists today. It provides security at the Olympics, World Cup Soccer, Formula One, and the Oscars. If Jesse James is a tragic hero, the fate of another legend, Wild Bill Hickok, had a significant share of farce. Wild Bill is the hero of anecdotes and hundreds of stories, but he's sort of the Baron Munchausen of the Wild West. He was indeed a skilled marksman, but he went down in history as an example of how gullible journalists and the public can be. Also, his death is the most famous and dramatic in frontier memory. The expression, dead man's hand, inspired by his death, has entered Western and poker lingo. James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, was born in 1837 in a small town in Illinois. His father was a farmer who was connected with the so-called Underground Railroad, meaning he helped runaway slaves from the South escape to freedom, and often enough engaged his son to do so. Jake liked to roam the woods alone, hunting, getting meat for the table, and moonlighting as a wolf shooter. Unlike most famous shooters, Wild Bill never broke the law in his youth and was generally a God-fearing man. During the Civil War, he joined the Northern Army as a scout, fought hard and bravely, often fighting behind enemy lines, then continued his service in the cavalry, fighting the Indians. It's not known how many Southerners and Indians he killed, obviously quite a few, but he had only 6 casualties on his record as a civilian, and they all attacked him. It was pure self-defense. With one sad exception, but that's a little further on. We don't know where the nickname Wild Bill came from. The most credible version is that once, back during the war, he single-handedly stopped a mob of lynch mobs. Eyewitnesses agreed that the act wild, and then the nickname stuck. It was said about Wild Bill that he carried 2 huge, beautiful revolvers with ivory grips everywhere during the Civil War, and that he had time to pull the trigger while he was grabbing the revolver, and that gave him a split-second advantage. But that's not why he became a national hero, but as a result of a rather comical story. In 1865, he met journalist George Nichols in the town of Springfield. Well, Bill spouted the choicest nonsense to mock the townsperson. The journalist took all the stories at face value, and the paper ran a rather enthusiastic report that claimed, among other things, that Wild Bill had killed 100 people. The whole of Springfield laughed at the article. Bill was known and respected there, but for him to shoot 100 cowboys, the journalist portrayed the townspeople as dirty savages whose only hobby was growing beards. The article caused a sensation. In a couple of years, Hickok was already the hero of a dozen newspaper articles and tabloid novels, that is, such a Superman of the frontier. Wild Bill couldn't stop and continued desperately mocking journalists. He told one of them that he had already killed well over 100 people. It looked like he had shot dozens more in a couple years. Another article described how Wild Bill rode his horse onto a pool table in a saloon, and then jumped his horse right through the door into the middle of the street. Readers were confused by absolutely nothing in the story. Bill himself was incredibly amused by the whole thing at first, but the joke had clearly gone on too long. He was approached by desperate young men who dreamed of shooting him to gain fame as the killer of the great Bill Hickok. Bill became paranoid. He always sat in the parlor with his back to the wall so no one would be behind him, laying newspapers in the room where he slept so that potential night killers would give themselves away by rustling. Looking ahead, the measures were quite reasonable. The day he broke his rule was his last. A lot of towns dreamed of getting Bill as sheriff, and he did spend some time in that position. His authority was such that his mere presence solved most conflicts and probably saved many lives. He once drove a whole crowd of dangerous cowboys out of town, With one phrase, he just said, "Boys, the train out of this town is going either east or west. Go in those directions or you'll be going north in the morning." There was a cemetery to the north of town. A great story has been preserved about how Wild Bill actually handled the gunfighters. It wasn't just about marksmanship, though of course it was that too. He had once had to kill a dangerous gunfighter. He got drunk and opened fire in the cabin. Bill went to handle the situation. A witness later recalled that when Bill saw a drunken cowboy with a gun, he started waving his arms and yelling, "Guys, guys, don't shoot him in the back of the head. He's drunk." Turned around to see who was going to shoot him in the back of the head, and Wild Bill blew his brains out with a revolver. Another time, he beat 2 drunken soldiers from a cavalry regiment. They, too, dreamed of the glory of killing Wild Bill and attacked the sheriff. One of them knocked Hickok to the ground and put the barrel to his temple, but the revolver misfired. While the cavalrymen were wondering what to do about it, Bill somehow twisted around and fired 3 bullets at the attackers. The result? 1 dead body and 1 colleague with a shot knee. Later, in 1871, Bill found himself in an even more dramatic situation. He was informed that a mob of 50 cowboys was about to tear apart the town where he was just serving as sheriff. In an attempt to calm the drunken mob, Bill got 3 feet away from the instigator. The man fired twice at point-blank range and missed. It cost him his life. After that, however, a terrible thing happened. Bill saw another man in the darkness with a gun at the ready and shot at him at point-blank range. It turned out to be his best friend who came to the rescue. That same day, the cold-blooded Bill was not ashamed of his feelings and wept uncontrollably over the body of his comrade who died in his arms. Hickok brought the body to his wife, paid for the funeral, and next it was as if he broke down. He never killed another man and generally lost his passion for heroism and bravado. In an attempt to quit old habits, Hickok went into show business. Fate brought him together with Buffalo Bill, who was just developing his Wild West show. The show was wildly popular and brought Wild Bill back to national fame. But he couldn't work there for long. He discovered an unexpected acting talent. But the big stuffy cities made him terribly bored. He was drawn back to the front. While wandering the Wild West, he found his true love, got married. Her health began to fail. She developed glaucoma, and it seemed like a good time to start a quiet life. But Bill was ruined by his faith in luck. He wanted to earn money for a trouble-free life with his wife and went to the city of Deadwood. By the way, there is a TV series of the same name about the life of this place, where Bill's story is given quite a lot of importance. It was a gold prospector's settlement built on Indian territories completely illegally. Not a great place to save for retirement. Hickok quickly realized that the easiest way to make money here was at the gambling table. It was at that table that he died. On August 2, 1876, Bill went to the No. 10 Saloon as usual. It's the hottest place in town. There he wanted to sit at the card table, but there was no room against the wall. So for the first time he broke his rule and sat with his back to the door. At this time, Jack McCool, a 25-year-old prankster and loser who had lost all his gold to Hickok the day before, entered the saloon. At one point he, daring to drink, approached Wild Bill from behind and shot him in the back of the head with a cry of, "Damn you and get it!" The bullet pierced the old gunfighter's head and wounded the player sitting opposite. Hickok's hands were 2 black aces and 2 black eights. This combination has since been called the dead man's hand. In many westerns, it directly hints that the character is going to die. Well, the killer was captured and tried in the local theater building. It says a lot about the town's mores that the gunman was acquitted and fled the town. Luckily, he fled to Wyoming, where he was caught again. The court decided that since Deadwood was an illegal town, the court decisions that were made there were illegal. So McCall just got hung, but that's not the most cinematic story yet. The most cinematic is Butch Cassidy and his Wild Gang. Cassidy was such a successful robber that Pinkerton agents tried to get him even in South America. He devised witty criminal strategies and would probably have gotten away with it if it hadn't been for a chance photograph taken during a farewell revelry. And his colorful biography became the basis for the highest-grossing Western in history. Robert Leroy Parker was born in 1866 in Utah to a family of devout Mormons. 13 years old, he settled on a ranch where he met a cattle rustler named Cassidy. This interesting man gave the boy what his parents could not, i.e., taught him to shoot and steal cattle. In addition, the boy worked part-time on the ranch as a butcher. That's how he got the name that he went down in history. He took the profession of Butch and the last name of his mentor. At the age of 18, Butch Cassidy stole a horse and ran away from home, associating with a gang of horse thieves. After settling in a small town, he acquired a habit that would set him apart from the rest of the Wild West bandits. In between crimes, Butch didn't shy away from simple jobs. He could rob a bank and then work as a boot camp on a farm for a while. It was a great way to cover his tracks. No one would look for a successful robber amongst the lowly fallen laborers. On June 24, 1889, Butch Cassidy and two buddies broke into a branch of the San Miguel Valley Bank and robbed it with surprising ease. Here was another characteristic of Cassidy: meticulous planning. Just so you understand, before the job, he spent weeks training his horse to stand still when the rider came running up and jumped into the saddle. After the robbery, the bandits split up, and Butch Cassidy waited out the danger by taking a job on a farm on the Utah-Colorado border. There he posed as a poor man in desperate need of money, even though the gang had stolen $20,000. He also had affairs with the owner's daughters and spent almost all his free time in his library reading books. Well, he had a good time while they were looking for him in the brothels and saloons. When passions subsided, Butch bought a farm in Wyoming. His neighbors remembered him as a charming young gentleman who loved his ranch. What was their surprise when Cassidy went to jail? Turns out he'd been using his new home as a staging area for stolen cattle. He was locked up for 2 years, but he didn't waste any time in prison. He was planning a robbery and plotting the composition of a new gang. When he got out, Butch immediately started putting together a crew to rob banks and trains. A couple of his friends got busted for murder, so it was the sheriff who claimed murder, but they insisted it was self-defense. A good lawyer was needed, which meant a lot of money. In August 1896, Butch and his friends robbed the Wyandotte Bank, as usual swift, filigreed, and very polite, except for one blow to the head with the handle of a pistol. The $7,000 in proceeds was enough to hire one of the best lawyers in the Wild West. Instead of the gallows, Butch's buddies got 5 years each. The gang grew, earned the nickname the Wild Bunch, and soon became the most successful on the frontier. In 5 years, Butch Cassidy had committed 9 major robberies, 4 banks, 4 trains, and 1 cash register of a prosperous company. The profits averaged $30,000 per case. The raiders had a recognizable M.O. They carefully planned the operation, worked only during the summer months, avoided bloodshed by any means possible, and constantly changed names and even nicknames to confuse Pinkerton agents. Again, between cases, Cassidy did not bend to simple work. He might well have started an honest life, and even planned to do so. He had no blood on him, and the government might well grant him amnesty. The unspoken laws of the Wild West came into play. The same Union Pacific Company whose trains Butch was robbing was willing to pardon him if he worked for them as a security consultant. Butch Cassidy and his best friend and sidekick, Sundance Keith, were among the first to realize that the time of the Wild West was gone. The frontier as such was no more. The Gan fighters had grown old and gone Buffalo Bill, and Pinkerton agents sat in just about every backwater town. The friends decided to take their mistresses and escape to South America. But it took one last job, a bank robbery in Nevada. The raid was committed in September 1900. The bandits arrived in town long before the robbery, pretended to be cattle drovers, of which there were hundreds. All the while, they were drinking with the locals in a saloon that was right across the street from the bank, gaining their trust and, more importantly, spending a lot of time with the local boys. Later, of course, the kids realized that the kind men who gave them candy, let them ride horses, and tell stories around the campfire were actually learning the town's secrets and the bank's routines. Especially lucky was the boy to whom Butch Cassidy had promised to give his horse and kept his promises. On September 19th, the gang headed to the saloon for a glass of whiskey. Then the robbers crossed the street, and soon Butch's booming voice sounded in the bank. "Gentlemen, raise your hands." Again an almost perfect robbery, swift, well coordinated, without unnecessary violence or fuss. The loot amounted to $32,640 in gold coins, quite enough to start a new life in South America. While fleeing, the savage gang stopped by a ranch where they took some racehorses. Ironically, the ranch belonged to the financier whose bank they had just robbed. Upon learning of this, the furious businessman yelled, "They robbed my bank and then stole my horses, which they used to get away from me." At the same farm, Buka left his white horse, asking him to give it to the same 10-year-old boy. For the rest of his life, that boy repeated, "A man who keeps his word to a child can't be bad." Well, they decided to celebrate the last deed with a bang. A wild gang gathered in a Texas town. Butch and his men took the best hotel rooms, basked in all the bars, the saloons, and then made a mistake that became the most colorful part of their legend. Knowing this was the last time they would see each other, Butch Cassidy, Sundance Whale, and their men took a group photo as a keepsake. I mean, there weren't any iPhones yet, and people were already starting to get steamed up on napkins. Anyway, it turned out classy, dashing. The photographer reproduced the photo and hung one copy in the window of his studio for all to see. Of course, he did not know that in front of him was the most recognizable, the most famous gang of the Wild West. A strange twist of fate brought one of Pinkerton's agents to the atelier. Soon the photo was sent to almost every police station in the country. It was urgent to escape. The count was not even days, but hours. Butch Cassidy arrived in New York City, where he hastily married his longtime girlfriend, who was either a teacher, a prostitute, or a prostitute who became a teacher. Soon Butch, Sundance, and the young wife were on a steamship to Argentina. In Patagonia, at the very edge of the land, the friends bought 625 acres and organized a ranch. Years of honest labor came in handy, business flourished, and that would have been the end of the Wild Gang story, but Pinkerton agents intervened. Having learned that Cassidy was in South America where he couldn't be reached, they set up a kind of setup, convincing the Argentine government that almost all crimes committed by gringos, i.e., visiting whites, were the work of Butch and Sundance personally. In particular, they were blamed for a bank robbery that took place thousands of kilometers away from the ranch. The fact that they could not physically travel 1,000 kilometers one way and 1,000 kilometers the other in 24 hours did not embarrass anyone. 00-37-53. Buccio was being hunted again. Cassidy and Kit fled to Chile and started doing what they knew and loved to do. They went back to robbery. Here their principle of "don't kill witnesses" played against them. The government of Chile and Argentina, wanting to blame all the unsolved cases of recent years on them, launched a large-scale hunt. It was much easier to find 2 gringos among the local population than 2 whites in the Wild West. And so it ended in 1908 in a Bolivian village. Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kit, exhausted from crossing a mountain pass, nearly frozen to death, stopped at the home of a local Indian family. By an unfortunate coincidence, several military men were stationed there. They immediately realized who these mysterious grinds were. The legendary bandits shot back from the Indian cabin for a while, but died. In addition to many lighter wounds, Butch was shot through the temple, and Sundance seized a bullet wound exactly in the forehead. Because of this, it is therefore believed that Keith shot his dying friend and then put a bullet in his forehead to keep himself alive. The 1969 movie about this, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Whale, made history as Hollywood's highest-grossing Western. But it's still not the most famous cowboy shootout. The classic Western scene in which two gang fighters are facing each other and suddenly someone pulls out a revolver and decides in a split second which of them will stay alive has a clear and well-known prototype in history. It's the famous shootout at Coral Oak in Arizona. In it, legendary gunslingers Dog Holliday and White Earp defeated a gang of cowboys wall-to-wall in a brutal battle. The story's central character, White Earp, is one of the frontier's most controversial characters. He was born in 1848 in Illinois to an honest farmer, but did not follow in his father's footsteps. Already in his 20s, he went to jail for theft, with the money he stole collected for school repairs. Investigations revealed that he had stolen cattle, that he had forged documents. Wyatt was lucky and got out on $500 bail. But after that, he had to flee the state. The rest of his life was uneventful with noble romance. He became co-owner of a brothel in Illinois, where he is remembered for beating prostitutes and customers. That was a bit of a problem, because the law was also using the brothel. Again arrest, again prison, but this time he had to escape. In general, Erb gained fame as a desperate and dangerous type, and this, as we remember, was valued as an indicator of a good crime fighter. He became a deputy sheriff in a town in the state of Kansas. And strangely enough, a great one, wild temper, and a willingness to be violent worked both ways. Erb pretty quickly cleansed the town of all questionable characters, well, except for himself, of course. But resting on his laurels was boring. He went to another Kansas town, Dodge City, where he became an assistant marshal and immediately got into a killing spree. A cowboy attacked White with his friends, but Erb found himself surrounded by comrades too. Which ones? Among them was Dog Holliday, a gang fighter known for having tuberculosis, so he had no fear of death, and also Beth Masterson, a veteran of many skirmishes with the Comanches. The attacker was killed. In 1879, Whiterpy ended up in a town in Arizona where he actually organized a mob. Together with his brothers, he began to tamper with local business and organize their own order. One brother ran a local saloon, another became a marshal, and the rest were his assistants. Having a lot of brothers in the Wild West was generally profitable. Doc Holliday eventually joined their crew. The brothers controlled the local mine, always stuck together, and inspired fear and respect from the locals. They ran the local business, and a rival gang, backed by the sheriff, took over the farmers and cowboys. Well, understandably, a war between the two groups was a matter of time. The Earps blamed the rivals and tried to have them arrested. The competitors were saving up their strength to fight back with arms. And so, on October 25, 1881, the conflict reached a critical point. The sheriff and his men brought a large shipment of stolen cattle into town. The accusations escalated into a saloon brawl. It ended with mutual promises to kill each other. And the chance came the very next day. On the 26th, the cowboys met at the local corral, a large cattle pen surrounded by a fence. The two rival gangs lined up opposite each other just a few feet away. Virgil Erb, like a marshal, ordered the cowboys to put their hands up and surrender. Instead, two dropped their revolvers. In the gunfight that ensued, 30 shots were fired in 30 seconds. 3 cowboys were killed, and 2 ERPs were wounded. After the skirmish, the sheriff arrested the Earps and Doc Holliday, but the court ruled it was self-defense and acquitted the brothers. But that was just the beginning. 2 of the cowboy gang began hunting their enemies. Soon, Virgil Earp was ambushed, shot in the shoulder, and left disabled. The youngest of the Earps, Morgan, was shot while he was in the saloon, shot through the window when the saloon was lighted and it was dark outside. The killers were never found. White Earp tried to track them down but mistakenly killed the wrong man, nearly went to jail and fled the state. He later went to Alaska, where he profited handsomely from the gold rush, then moved to California, where he apparently dabbled in card games and real estate speculation. He lived to be 80 years old and died in 1929 of cancer. Dog Holliday passed away much earlier, in 1887, from tuberculosis, lamenting that he had not died in battle. The skirmish at Coral Log became one of the most frequently retold legends of the Wild West. Many movies have been made about it, and dozens of books have been written. You could say that all the existing dueling episodes in the movies are just endless references to a gunfight between the Earps and a gang of their enemies. How do we even know all this stuff? Why have these stories even survived in such detail and become part of popular culture? For that, we have another Deho West legend to thank, Buffalo Bill. His life started out about the same as the rest of the legends. His father died early. Bill started working for a courier company when he was 11 years old, and by that age he was already riding beautifully. Then he was in the Civil War, distinguished himself in battle, hunted buffalo. All in all, just like everybody else. He could have robbed banks, but he was lucky to be famous. In 1869, when he was only 23 years old, he met a tabloid journalist, the author of the so-called dime westerns, and the latter made him the hero of another novel. They soon wrote a play based on the novel, and Buffalo Bill himself was invited to play in it. He wasn't much of an actor, but the unsophisticated public in civilized cities would flock to this performance to see a live-action hero. Buffalo Bill quickly realized that no theater is not needed here. You need a circus. In 1874, he found an experienced producer and founded his own show, something between a traveling circus and a traveling ethnographic exhibition. Cowboys, Indians, and other characters showed horse tricks, shot at targets, told stories, showed their exotic costumes, and acted out scenes from Wild West life with famous shootings and famous robberies. Some of them were professional actors, some were real authentic adventurers like Wild Bill Hickok or a legendary Indian chief named Sitting Bull. The further you went, the more the distinction between the two categories became blurred, and the whole thing toured nonstop for 10 years, not only in America, but also in Europe. The audiences were absolutely enthralled. Nobody was interested in what really happened in the Wild West. It was these circus cowboys that remained in mass culture, and it was they who established the myth of the frontier as a national myth. The American historian Frederick Turner has already been mentioned today. His landmark work, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, was published in 1893. The Wild West had almost ceased to be wild by then. Everything had been mastered. It's all the more amusing that Turner declared it was the frontier that was the cornerstone of American culture and the American worldview. In the 19th century, America in general tried to be such a new Europe and, if possible, to follow the British and French. So Turner said that America has its own special way. Let the weak Europeans mess around with their books and theories, but a normal cowboy understands everything about life without books. The frontier with its daily challenges was, in Turner's version, better than any university because it produced democratic institutions of its own. The idea was new and controversial, but it won out and by the early 20th century had become nationally mainstream. Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok and his bikes, without wanting to, became the basis of the state myth. Well, then came Hollywood, and Americans finally felt like cowboys, about the time when there were no real cowboys left. Well, after America, the whole world got cowboys sick. Whether that's good or bad, it's hard to say. But now at least you know who to thank for the Yugoslav westerns with Gojk Mitic.